Hello, alumni activists. Thank you for joining Alums for Campus Fairness as we finish off our newest webinar series, Investigating Modern Conspiracy Theories. My name is Joel Bond, and I am the Associate Director of Alums for Campus Fairness. I'm happy to be joined by Dr. Andrew Pessin, a professor of philosophy at Connecticut College and Campus Bureau Editor of the Allgemeiner. Let me welcome to the stage, Dr. Andrew Pessin.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks for having me. Welcome back, everybody. If everybody is a returnee, if you're new today, welcome aboard. I hope everyone had a nice Thanksgiving. Our last session was 2 weeks ago, feels like a million years ago. So let me quickly remind you where we are. I'll do a quick reminder, and then I'll zip through a few of the slides from our last session to get us up to speed before we move forward. We're really I think at a key point in the book. We start off with the idea that there's right-wing anti-Semitism, left-wing anti-Zionism, and we now have the materials where we will see that the right wing is both anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, and the left wing is anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, and the two shall come together. You might remember that horseshoe diagram we looked at probably the first session, this idea that the extreme right merges into the extreme left. Well, that's going to happen tonight. And I think one of the great contributions of Scott's book is that it really opened my eyes to, in the end, the utter indistinguishability of the right wing and the left wing with respect to Jews and Israel. So we'll see that in just a couple of minutes. I can't promise that we're going to be able to complete the book in the time that we have tonight. If we're getting close to that, I might, towards the end, skip the question period so that we can wrap up. If it doesn't look like we'll get to the end, and we'll have those questions. But I do urge you, as a number of you have along the way, please feel free to reach out to me with questions, comments, start a conversation if you like. You can reach me via my website, andrewpessin.com. That's one word, andrewpessin.com. There's a link there that you can connect to me. So if I don't get a chance to hear your question or to offer a comment, or you just want to begin a dialogue, please reach out to me that way. Okay, so a reminder of what we've covered in the 4 previous sessions. Through Scott's book, we saw what a conspiracy theory is, what's meant by a conspiracy theory, and the disregard or ultimately disinterest that conspiracy theories have with respect to truth and evidence. We saw how right-wing anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Zionism, as manifest in these 2 professors, but also manifest more broadly across the academy for sure with the left, how both of these positions amount to conspiracy theories as we define them. We saw how easily refuted the conspiracy theories are and can be, and how important it is for you as an activist, if you want to stand up for Jews and stand up for Israel, to be able to refute these theories. It's easy to do it. You have to be informed. You have to know the facts. You have to educate yourself. But precisely because these theories have such little interest in the truth and evidence, they're actually quite easy to refute. And that takes us to last week's slide. So I'll just sort of quickly go through the last few slides of last week. There's the section of the book that we were just getting into. So after establishing the right and left wing theories as conspiracy theories, we began to see where they came from and how they got into the academy. And basically, there's a straight line from Nazi conspiracy theories, literally Nazi conspiracies, to right-wing conspiracy theories today. And there's a straight line from Soviet anti-Semitism to Soviet anti-Zionism to left-wing anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism today. We went through that with the right wing. It's slightly more complex with the left wing, but nevertheless, it's still a straight line. We saw how the Soviet Union openly developed motivated by their anti-Semitism, developed an anti-Zionist strategy and direct propaganda. We saw that the KGB literally was behind this propaganda effort. And along the way, they also disseminated the Protocols for the Elders of Zion, this classic anti-Semitic text, which came out of Russia in the first place. KGB disseminated, they began flooding the Islamic world with Arabic translations of this book in the 1970s in order to foment hatred, the hatred which was already brewing against the Jews, but they wanted to whip it into a frenzy for political purposes. So this whole left-wing movement is part of the Soviet Cold War strategy to destroy the Jews, basically. And then we saw how these ideas got into the academy after World War II. Marxism became a very popular thing amongst many professors as the professoriate began leaning left. And as a result, particularly with the influence of this activist scholar, Angela Davis, the academia became dominated by left-wing thinkers who are now transmitting this ideology, this anti-Zionist ideology grounded in anti-Semitism by means of the Soviet Union into the academy. And there was Angela Davis, and we pointed out that it is everywhere and growing. I did recommend several books to check out that document this whole process. All of these are excellent books. The newest book is this one by David L. Bernstein, just came out last month. Very important book to study the anti-Semitism in the academy, which is now all wrapped up with wokeism and critical race theory, and we'll be talking more about those things in a few moments. And then here's a couple of important books from the right, from conservatives, worrying about the left-wing takeover, not only of the academy, but of many industries and institutions. And that's about where we were. So we're now up to speed, and we will move forward, and we will see now we have all the tools to make that horseshoe close up and become that circle where the extreme right just merges with the extreme left, and you just can't tell the difference between them. So lots of examples, and I'll show you some images tonight in the next few minutes. So start off with, they use the same tropes. Angela Davis, this left-wing icon, Arthur Butts, the representative of the right wing in the academy. Angela Davis, when discussing this, remember this JVP program called the Deadly Exchange, they were condemning and trying to stop these police exchanges between Israel and a few departments in the United States. And Angela Davis basically sketches things as if somehow the Israeli police pollute the minds of American police and turn them into terrible racists and are responsible for police brutality. And Butts uses exactly the same language about how the Jews and Zionists polluted the minds of Americans who came in contact with them at the Nuremberg trials. We have the New York Times, I would say fairly left, but certainly left of center mainstream newspaper, and Alice Walker, an icon of the left. Well, in 2018, the New York Times did a fawning interview of Alice Walker. She is a woman of color, a famous and talented writer. And in this interview, she spent her time, published by the New York Times, promoting the work of the right-wing figure, David Icke. And I do emphasize Icke. He is just an outright anti-Semite. He wrote a book called And the Truth Shall Set You Free. Amongst David Icke's claims are that Hitler was a Jewish agent of Zionism, both that the Jews funded the Holocaust and that the Holocaust didn't happen. So, you know how that works. It literally claims that Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a true book, etc. And so Alice Walker in the New York Times fawns over this guy, as well as refers to her long screed, an anti-Talmud screed. She wrote a long, you could call it a poem, excoriating the Talmud, the heart of the Orthodox Jewish religion. And her sources for the screed, she took directly from neo-Nazi sites. So a left-wing paper publishing an fawning interview with a left-wing icon promoting all sorts of right-wing ideology. Alice Walker certainly used neo-Nazi sites to source her anti-Talmud poem. We have David Duke, the famous white supremacist former politician, condemning Trump. Even as the left calls Trump a white supremacist, we have David Duke, the white supremacist, condemning Trump and praising who? Ilhan Omar, this icon of the left. He hates Jews and Israel more than he might otherwise like Trump. And of course, he despises Ilhan Omar, but he'll side with her against the Jews. So right and left coming together. Elder of Zion, my favorite blogger, I'll be mentioning him a couple of times tonight. He goes through a number of examples of right-wing and left-wing literally sharing anti-Semitic sources. The Buffalo shooter, you might remember in May of this year, this man shot up a grocery store in Buffalo, I believe, killed something like 11 people, injured many more. He had a whole manifesto. And in his manifesto, he drew equally from right and left-wing sources. He took his racial theories from far-right websites, his white supremacy from far-right websites, but it was filled with attacks on Israel taken from anti-Zionist left-wing sites, including claims about Israeli false flag operations, Israel's pursuit of greater Israel, war crimes against the Arabs, etc. He also borrowed from the Nation of Islam and promoted the absurd idea that Jews were behind the slave trade. And so, ironically, you have this white supremacist guy who despises blacks, Arabs, and Muslims, but gladly draws from them in order to attack the Jews. There's a neo-Nazi website called Stormfront, which quotes leftist sources on a regular basis. Roger Waters, the former Pink Floyd musician, broke my heart because I love Pink Floyd, but I can't tolerate him anymore. He's a vicious anti-Semite, anti-Zionist. He also has used neo-Nazi sources. And as we mentioned, the KGB, literally, so the KGB, the spy organization of the global source of left-wing ideology, the Soviet Union, flooded the Arab world with copies of the classic right-wing text, Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Right? And one of my favorite cases in 2021, Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP, this leftist anti-Zionist, allegedly Jewish group, found itself at the same rally as a bunch of neo-Nazis. They were both protesting a church that was fundraising for Israel. And there's a quote in the article that's the source for this. And the woman from JVP says, I'm horrified to see these people here and somehow lack the self-reflection that she's on the same side as the neo-Nazis here. So you've got the neo-Nazi right and the JVP left joining forces at a rally. There's endless numbers of examples of this. I'll take you through a couple more. Once you see it, you can't unsee it, and the right and left will be indistinguishable to you as well. The New York Times, again, left of center mainstream newspaper, published this cartoon on the upper left in 2019, of which Bret Stephens said the following. He said, "Here was an image that in another age might have been published in the pages of Der Stürmer," which was, of course, the main Nazi propaganda newspaper. "The Jew in the form of a dog, the small but wily Jew leading the dumb and trusting American, the hated Trump being Judaized with a skull cap, the nominal servant acting as the true master. The cartoon checked so many anti-Semitic boxes, the only thing missing was a dollar sign." On the upper right, what we see, blogger, or rather social media, she's on Twitter, does a lot, Claire Voltaire, I don't know who she is, but we see the epitome of the intersection where the far left and the far right meet. On the left, we see far left activists setting fire to an Israeli flag at a KKK rally. And on the right, we see neo-Nazis urinating on an Israeli flag at a Detroit Pride event. Right and left come together. And of course, white supremacists have their new friend Kanye West. Kanye, as a black celebrity, is a representative of the left. He ignited, of course, a long storm of white supremacist activity in the weeks after his particular coming out as an open DEFCON 3 anti-Semite. White supremacists all over the country did things like this, hang banners saying Kanye is right about the Jews, etc. We, of course, are seeing in recent weeks a prominent surging black anti-Semitism. Kanye West, Kyrie Irving, Dave Chappelle on Saturday Night Live. These leading black celebrities and influencers, as blacks, they're supported by all the good anti-racists on the left. But these folks just love this right-wing protocols tropes of Jews control the money, Jews control Hollywood, Jews control the world. So these figures just endorse the same right-wing anti-Semitism as the neo-Nazi white supremacists. So too, carrying on, we see this nice sign. This was a couple of months ago in Hollywood, California. Someone plastered this large sticker on a billboard, "Zionist Jews control America." So very nice. If it was just Jews control America, you might think it's right wing, but then you slap the word Zionist in front of it and maybe you can pretend it's left wing. But of course, the reality is you can't tell the difference. The phrase "Free Palestine," which is scrawled everywhere, all over the country, all sorts of institutions, synagogues, Jewish restaurants, Hillel houses, Chabad houses, on campuses and things like that. So on the bottom left, we see a Black Lives Matter, a left-wing protester spray painting "Free Palestine" on a synagogue driveway. And on the right, we have a messianic synagogue. So a synagogue, but a messianic one, itself daubed with the same expression, Free Palestine, but also a swastika thrown in. So is that maybe a right-winger graffitiing Free Palestine, whereas the left-winger on the left? Does it make a difference? It can be hard to tell. Here we see a nice anti-Zionist sticker sticking a sword through the Jewish star, which is, of course, on the Israeli flag. Hard to tell the difference, but it says resist Zionism. This was, by the way, a sticker or a set of stickers that were plastered all over the University of Albany in October, a few weeks ago. So is this some left-wing anti-Zionism? Well, nope. In this case, some of the other flyers that were plastered were these. So I guess this was probably a right-wing group. But of course, the main purpose is we can no longer tell the difference. It's coming at us from every direction, and it's the same no matter what direction it comes from. This brings us to chapter 9 of the book, which focuses more on politics than on campus. But of course, there's an open door between the political world and the campus world, and they mutually influence each other. So it's worth spending a little time on this chapter as well. Many people think of the right as endorsing racial anti-Semitism and think of the left as having some sort of principled opposition to Israeli policies. But of course, no. Indeed, on the left, what do? As we've seen, they make false claims of an alliance between Zionism and white supremacism. They think of Jews as white racists with white privilege. And both sides obsess conspiratorially about Israel. So basically, both sides hate the Jews and both sides hate Israel. No difference between them. Swastikas graffitied everywhere, all over the country. Again, every institution, all over campuses. Literally, I scour the internet every morning as I do my work as campus bureau editor for the Allgemeiner. Just a reminder, you should sign up for the daily newsletter of the Allgemeiner in order to stay informed. And literally every 2 or 3 days, there's a report of swastikas on another campus in North America and in Europe, etc. It's a daily onslaught, swastikas. Well, the right graffitis swastikas because they endorse Nazism. And so when you graffiti a swastika, that's your statement of right-wing neo-Nazism. But of course, the left regularly calls Israel and Israelis the new Nazis. So they also graffiti swastikas to label the Jews, the Israelis, as neo-Nazis. So both sides graffiti swastikas. And when you see a swastika on campus, you don't know who it's coming from. Could be coming from either or both. Scott, in this chapter, takes us through a catalog of far-right movements that reject Zionism. That's not much of a surprise. He discusses Islamist movements such as Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, etc. These movements are, of course, just dripping with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Please do not forget the Hamas charter, which I'm teaching a class on Zionism and anti-Zionism right now. And the charter is assigned for tomorrow. And it's just, you must read that at some point because this is, I hope some of the students' eyes pop out. They'll come in with like an eye patch tomorrow reading this charter, which is just dripping with Jew hatred and openly calls for the murder of all Jews everywhere. It's not just anti-Zionism, it's open anti-Semitism, Jew murder, calling for Jew murder, right? It references the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as a factual book and indeed takes information from that book in their charter and reports it as factual. So this is an Islamist movement influenced obviously by these right-wing texts, which produces what's sometimes called the right-left alliance. You'll sometimes see it referred to as the green-red alliance, green being the color of Islam and red being the color of left-wing movements. The left, certainly in the West, the left loves Islam and loves the Muslims, supports the Palestinians over the Jews, but who are they supporting? They are supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, who are far-right national movements. Right. So these left-wing movements here, because they hate the Jews so much, support these far-right national movements who, of course, despise them in return, but are happy to take their support in their mutual war against Israel. Perhaps the most famous example of this is the scholar Judith Butler. She is an icon of the left. She was a gender studies scholar. She was a very prominent lesbian back in the day. I don't know if what her gender affiliation identity is today, but in any case, she is absolutely a major scholar in gender studies and on the left. And she famously said, this was already some 15 years ago, she said that it's important to understand that Hamas and Hezbollah as social movements that are progressive, that are on the left, that are part of the global left. So this left-wing figure sees Hamas and Hezbollah as a left-wing movements. This is a total inversion of reality. Indeed, for the record, Hamas literally murders gay people like Butler, literally murders gay people like Butler. And yet, in her mind, this right-wing nationalist, these ultra-religious movements are somehow part of the progressive left. Why? Because they hate Jews and they hate Israel. That's why. Otherwise, they have absolutely nothing in common. Scott takes us through a bunch of far left political movements, all of which, of course, oppose Zionism across the globe, starting with the Soviet bloc, including all of today's progressive political movements. Don't forget that literally every single BDS resolution that's passed by a student government on a North American campus is endorsed, sponsored by not merely Students for Justice in Palestine, but also by the Black groups, the LGBTQ groups, the women's groups, the sexual assault groups, the Hispanic groups, the campus climate and environment groups, and of course, the Muslim and Arab groups. So all the left-wing progressive groups on campus come together in their opposition to everything Zionist and everything Jewish. Indeed, the rejection of Zionism by many Black intellectuals is due not to rational opposition to some opposing political views. After all, most Jews are very pro-civil rights, very anti-racist. Most Jews vote Democrat, certainly in America. They lean to the left. You'd think there would be solidarity there, but no, Black intellectuals have this opposition, ultimately to their far left roots, the influence of Marxism and communism in the 60s and 70s has produced this anti-Semitic outlook. So despite the fact that Jews should be natural allies on the left, they, of course, are seen as the enemy. And lastly, I'll just mention this trope of Jewish supremacism. This is a phrase, this is a far-right trope. It traces back to the protocols for the Elders of Zion. It's the Jewish idea of taking over the world. This is a nasty thing that right-wingers used to refer to Jews, but it has now utterly morphed into the vocabulary of left-wing anti-Zionisms on campus and beyond. It's popping up all over the place in the past several years. Alice Walker's Talmud poem makes reference to Jewish supremacy. All the orgy of anti-Israel petitions that were released, hundreds of them in May of 2021, during the Israel's last conflict with Hamas. You might remember literally hundreds of departments, dozens and dozens of universities put out these disgusting statements filled with lies. And the common trope in all of them was condemning Israel for its Jewish supremacist policies, that Zionism was a platform of Jewish supremacism. So you have this classic right-wing term that's now just part of the everyday vocabulary of the left. So can't tell the difference. It's coming from the left, it's coming from the right, and it's literally indistinguishable. The language, the tropes, the strategies, the graffiti, no difference between the right and the left. The next time someone says to you, oh, you know, all anti-Semitism in the United States is just all from the right wing, I hope you'll have some of these resources available to say, you know what, the left wing endorses everything the right wing is doing here, and indeed shares sources and speaks the same language. This brings us to part 4 of the book, where Scott begins the turn towards, and I hope we'll get to this at the end, what should we do? How should we respond? It takes a little while to get to the practical proposals, but this is the turn that's happening now. Not a surprise, what is going to inform this last part of the book as he makes the turn towards practical proposals is the emphasis on the golden rule and the motto, which you might remember is sort of the reigning theme of these sessions over the last few weeks. The golden rule and Northwestern's official motto represented moral and academic integrity, which Scott isolates as the failure to respect those as being the primary source of the rise of these conspiracy theories. on campus. So the key thing will be to re-emphasize the golden rule and the model and put them back to the work that they originally did and ought to continue to be doing. The rule and the motto remind us there's only one truth, and feelings must be trumped by facts. The goal of the university is to acquire knowledge, produce knowledge, get at the truth. Conspiracy theories, again, have a very uncomfortable relationship to the truth. They're not interested in the facts. They're not interested in the evidence, and sometimes they're outright fabricated. So adherence to the rule and the motto should, at least in principle, deflate these conspiracy theories. We are also reminded, especially from the golden rule, that there is just one humanity. We're all one on some level, despite our many differences. So justice must be universal. And most importantly, we have to use uniform standards, double standards being one of the many ways of weaponizing the academy against Israel, applying double standards to Israel. And that obviously violates the motto and the rule. There must be uniform standards. The big problem here, and I worry that Scott is more optimistic than I am, I think, on this particular point. He is optimistic that if you really enforce the motto and the rule, the golden rule, you'll see, and Nazis should see, that there really was no evidence of Jewish plots to destroy Germany, right? The Jews had no plots. They were small in number. They were powerless. They were diverse in ideology and religion. They were unarmed. You know, what a rational person would instantly see is the Jews pose no threat to Nazi Germany. So why can't they see it, the Nazis, right? Scott has the confidence that if we just point out the facts and insist on the evidence to the anti-Zionists who dominate the academy today, they'll see the truth. I'm a little less optimistic about that, partly because the other side likes to say, they like to claim that they're the ones respecting the evidence, that they're the ones respecting the truth here. You know, you can certainly find, for example, racists in the United States South who believe that they had the high moral ground in supporting slavery. And Hitler believed he was fighting the evil, immoral Jews. He believed that truth and integrity were on his side. The other side will claim that for themselves, despite our seeing so clearly that they are deluding themselves. So I think you actually need to supplement the insistence. You do need this insistence on the motto and the rule. Absolutely, academic and moral integrity are bedrock, essential. But I personally think you need to supplement that with awareness of what I call epistemic anti-Semitism. This is the idea that in the mind of an anti-Semite, their belief-forming processes are so corrupted that they believe that, yeah, they're opposed to the Jews, but for good reason, because the Jews are up to a whole bunch of nasty things, and they think they are paying attention to the evidence and the truth, but the anti-Semitism has really corrupted their belief-producing processes. So a little plug, I did write a paper on this issue called epistemic anti-Semitism, or how decent people can be anti-Semitic and not even know it. It appears in the volume I published with my colleague Corinne Blackmer this past year on anti-Semitism in contemporary America. So if you're interested, please do check that out. I think awareness of this has to supplement Scott's insistence on the motto and the rule, at least in my opinion. Scott takes us through now a study of how a reasonable theory can get abused and basically go bad, just how good people can go bad when their belief-forming processes get corrupted. Good theories, or theories that have value in them, can become ultimately corrupted. Here he's charitably recognizing that the key left-wing theories that are dominating the academy today, we'll use a number of phrases. We'll be talking about decolonial theory in a moment, but the other phrases are more or less approximately synonymous: anti-racism, critical race theory, even wokeism, which is a vaguer term, etc. These are all terms that characterize the left-wing theories dominating the academy today. They have some virtues. They're not just complete nonsense. They actually all start probably in a good and important place, but then they go wrong, or then they are corrupted in certain ways that Scott very, I think, insightfully manages to document. And when they go wrong, they end up providing a socially acceptable way to express Jew hatred. You cloak it in virtue by arguing that you're in favor of decolonialism or liberation or human rights or social justice, all anti-racism. All of those things are wonderful things, but in the end, they are cloaking what is really a deeply rooted Jew hatred underneath them. So once you've managed to weave some story or narrative by which anti-racism means liberating Palestine and destroying Israel, then anyone who stands up for Jewish lives and stands up for Jewish rights and stands up for the existence of the state of Israel is automatically a racist. And clearly something has gone wrong there. That's what happens when these theories get corrupted. So how do they get corrupted? They start off with something valuable, a positive motivation, but they turn into something really quite evil. Scott identifies a couple of tweets from our friend Stephen Thrasher, the representative of Left Wing Academy, who teaches at Northwestern, you'll remember, in which he insists that he would not ever trust an academic who did not have graduate classes in ethnic, women's, queer, or Black, or Native, or Asian American studies. Anyone who lacks that training is untrustworthy. And further, too, he basically demands that his colleagues and his field adopt the anti-racist decolonial approach. So the issue here is, how does it begin to go wrong? Not in its initial insights, but when it insists that it is the only legitimate way to understand the world, when it insists on an intellectual hegemony, it must dominate, and anyone who disagrees cannot be trusted, which is, of course, the first step to must be silenced and must be removed, which is what leads to the situation we see on campuses to this day. Indeed, decolonial theory, anti-racism, critical race theory, etc., is the overwhelmingly dominant ideology across the academy today, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences. We'll just use the phrase decolonial theory. It seems initially to fit the motto and the rule. Remember, it starts in a good place. Post-colonial challenges to Western European white supremacism, rejecting imperialism, rejecting colonialism. Those most mainstream people will agree are good things, to challenge those things, rather. But it goes wrong, as we saw already, when it becomes the dominant ideology and begins excluding other ideologies. It also goes wrong, specifically violating the motto and the rule, when it's applied selectively, when it undergoes selective application. And so you will see the scholars who promote and pursue these types of theories will only apply them to modern European colonialism and just simply ignore the rest of the world, including Iranians, Turks, Arabs, not to mention Japanese, Chinese, Russians, all of whom long had ever-expanding, expansive imperialist, colonialist empires, killing and enslaving and oppressing millions along the way over the course of history, including long ruling over Jewish minorities who were scattered throughout the diaspora, and many of whom are still, even today, behaving very problematically towards their diverse minority indigenous populations, whether it's the Uyghurs or the Tibetans or the Kurds or the Baha'i or the Maronites or the Copts or the Yazidis, and the list goes on, or the Jews. The list goes on and on. They only apply their criticisms to the West, to European colonialism, imperialism, and are simply blind to the colonialism, imperialism that has gone on by all sorts of other peoples throughout history and continues to go on to this day. As a result, they wrongly see supporting Palestinian Arabs, and thus being anti-Zionists, as part of being anti-imperialist. Why? Because in their eyes, in their minds, they can only see white people as imperialist oppressors. They simply cannot see Arabs or Muslims as being imperialist oppressors. And so therefore, the Zionists, who are Jews and white somehow, are the imperialists and oppressors. And to be a decolonialist, anti-imperialist means you have to condemn the Zionists. In fact, if you take even the medium historical view, at least the long-term historical view, the truth is, again, exactly the opposite. What's happening with Zionism is that Jews are reclaiming their land from the imperialist colonizers who long ago conquered it. That's what's happening. But because their selective application. Only whites can do evil. Only whites can be colonialist, imperialist oppressors. The only way they can look at this conflict is to see the Zionists as the imperialists. At the same time, I already hinted at this, the theory goes wrong by injecting Western racial categories into foreign contexts. Right. So there's serious issues with racism in the United States today. We don't need to deny that. But for example, Scott points out, Iranians self-conceive as being racially superior to numerous other peoples. But from our perspective, or from Western left-wing folks, they're called brown or people of color as if they're oppressed. And so you get these very simple identifications. Whites are privileged and oppressors, and people of color, which is an enormously wide group, are marginalized and oppressed. And so you look across the world, you'll see Iranians as being people of color and therefore oppressed, when that's not how they think of themselves. In general, Muslims are seen in the Western left as being people of color, and therefore as being oppressed, marginalized, perhaps because they are that way to some degree in the West. But in fact, across the world, Muslims are the dominant majority in some 50+ countries and often profound oppressors of the minorities who live in their midst. And so the left-wingers think of Muslims as people of color who are oppressed, when in fact around the world, again, the exact opposite is true. And you could just start Googling Muslim persecution and violence towards Christians, for example, in countries such as Sudan, Nigeria, Egypt, the persecution of Kurds, right? The Turks are once again bombing the Kurds, et cetera, et cetera. So the truth is quite the opposite there. And as such, the left wing will see Palestinian Arabs as people of color, Jews as being white, and therefore all they can see when they look to the Middle East, is white people oppressing brown people in the same way as allegedly white people oppress brown people in the United States, and therefore the Zionists are the bad guys. The truth, of course, is, if you're interested in facts, that the Palestinians have a very wide range of skin tones, from very light to very dark, as do Israeli Jews, including the at least 50% of Israeli Jews who are Mizrahi, who come from Arab countries or North Africa. In truth, the conflict is, in fact, very complicated. This isn't a racial conflict in the way that the United States maybe suffers from racial conflict. It's a conflict between two peoples, each claiming the same land. Right? And indeed, arguably, it is the Arabs and Muslims who are oppressing the Jews when you look at the bigger picture. And I'm going to show you a map of that in just a moment. Right? It's the Arabs and Muslims. There are some 23 Arab countries. There's some 50+ Muslim majority countries, almost all of whom are aligned against the Jews. But the Western left can't see it because whites oppress dark. White people oppress people of color. Jews are white, therefore they're oppressing all the people of color. Indeed, Jews are oppressing the entire Arab Muslim world, which is basically protocols anti-Semitism. Take a look at this picture from Elder of Zion. This, the PLO had just recently had one of their national committee meetings. The PLO is run by 16 white men, progressive silent, right? Which I think says more than I can say. Not a surprise, decolonial theory just gets Zionism totally wrong. It wrongly sees Zionism as a European settler colonial movement, and it does this by overlooking many key facts, the many ways in which Zionism is not a European settler colonial movement. Jews were refugees who had no home state from which to colonize. Jews were refugees who had no place else to go. They were not ethnic cleansers. Jews had an ancient history and continuous presence in that land. They're indigenous to the region, including they had a state in that region for a very long time back. Jews are the marginalized, victimized minority in need of protection. They are not the aggressors. The left-wing movement will see Israel and Jews as uniquely evil in the context of the Middle East because they ignore the many sins of the Arabs and the Muslims. They simply do not see them in the selective application of their theory. And when you ignore the many sins, the many bad behaviors, let's just start with the terrorism targeting civilians, for example. When you ignore the sins as if they don't exist and never occurred, then everything Israel might do in self-defense will look like an aggression to you. The scholar, the viciously anti-Israel, former Israeli scholar Ilan Pappé wrote a book called Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and it's a stunning book to read. He describes the various battles in the wars of the War of Independence, the War of 1948, and in many of them, he essentially leaves out the Arabs attacking. So the description you get, it's as if Jewish soldiers come into a village and they just start firing with guns blazing, killing everybody they see. He leaves out the fact that there was a war going on, that they were shooting because Arabs were shooting at them, et cetera, et cetera. So he tells the whole story without seeing the other side. And of course, Israelis look horrible and evil in a story like that. Israel ends up getting condemned for every military action as an aggressor, no matter how clearly defensive those actions are. The separation barrier, enforcing the blockade on Gaza. Israel even gets condemned for having bomb shelters and the Iron Dome. What does the Iron Dome do? It shoots down incoming missiles. It's a 100% defensive weapon. Israel gets condemned for that because it's unfair. The Palestinians don't have that. So it gives Israel an unfair advantage, makes them into the aggressors for having this device. The left ends up opposed to Jewish nationalism while supporting Palestinian nationalism because it can only see the former as bad. It cannot see the latter as bad. It is this theory and its proponents are deeply inconsistent in so many ways. I'll list just a few. They praise and value indigenous people and their culture and support the liberation of indigenous people, except for the Jews. They support nationalism and self-determination for all peoples, except for the Jews. They claim to oppose human rights abuses, but only when committed by Jews, and ignore everything else going on in the rest of the world, including the Arabs, including the Palestinians, etc. This unpacked video is quite good. I do recommend it as well. It's about intersectionality, another word for these theories, the idea that all forms of oppression are interconnected, which means all marginalized people are uniformly oppressed by a single oppressor who in the end ends up being the white Jew. It's a very dangerous theory. It too starts off in a good place with some values and virtues, but it ends up becoming corrupt and weaponized. And in the end, it is the Jew who is the great evildoer in the world. And so decolonial theory, however it started, in its good place with some good important insights, and it's worthy of study. Nevertheless, in its application to these issues, it overlooks numerous facts. It utterly distorts values and is deeply inconsistent, i.e., it has violated the motto and the rule all over the place. And in so doing, it turns the truth about Zionism and the conflict into an utter distortion of reality. The truth, again, is that this is a national conflict between two peoples over the same land. Distortion, and this is now the dominant view on most campuses in North America and Europe, the distortion is that this is indigenous people versus the colonialists. It is white people versus the people of color. It is the rich versus the poor, which in turn, and you know who's the bad guy in each one of these disjunctions, this means it is evil Israel one way oppressing the innocent Palestinians. That is the distortion. To get a good look at this graphically, visually, this is how the left, this is how decolonial theory sees things. It is big, strong, white Israel, notice, dominating these little green areas, these colored areas, which of course represent the Palestinians. And if this is your vision of the conflict, if you have a natural tendency, as many kind-hearted, sympathetic people do, to side with the weaker over the stronger, to side David over the Goliath, well, if this is how you see things, then you can see white Israel is overpowering colored Palestine, let's say here. But of course, another perspective, and I would argue a truer, more accurate perspective, is this one. This is the conflict. It is the entire Arab and Muslim world against tiny, tiny little Israel. And in this view, David and Goliath looks quite a lot different. You can barely see Israel on this map. The one tiny little sliver of a Jewish state is threatened by this massive conglomeration of states, which is the Muslim world. This is representing Muslim majority countries over here. To fail to see people other than the Jews as possibly aggressors, as possibly racist, as possibly threats, is to only see this and just not see that. Bare minimum, you have to see both as you make up your own minds on how to understand this conflict, it seems to me. But with selective application, decolonial theory just does not see this picture at all. So in sum, by violating the motto and the rule, decolonial theory becomes dogma. It becomes ideology. It thus goes from being a legitimate and useful theory to being a false theory, weaponized as an instrument of hate, cloaking itself in feigned virtue. A particularly heinous, and I do think I'm going to go all the way to 8:30 because I'd love to cover a bit more for you. And so again, please feel free to reach out to me through my website, andrewpessin.com, to ask questions or carry on the conversation. A particularly heinous example of this corruption and distortion, and I'll just mention this because it's so important. International law, the failure to enforce the motto and the rule in the right way, leads to the utter distortion of and weaponization of international law, which is just turned against Jews and turned against Israel all the time by the academy, the dominant ideology in the academy. I just listed here, I went through Elder of Zion. This is something he's very good on. He regularly goes through issues of international law. There's a whole bunch of articles here. In fact, he recently published a book, and many of these articles are in that book on the right. I do commend that to you. To see how international law is literally weaponized and falsified. They literally lie about international law in order to make Israel a permanent criminal in every possible way. Just today, by the way, NGO Monitor, which is a really important NGO itself, which monitors other anti-Israel NGOs, they just published a detailed report debunking Human Rights Watch report of this past year, claiming that Israel is an apartheid state. They literally went through it line by line by line to show the lies, the distortions, the misrepresentations, the omissions, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a term of international law. Like apartheid actually has a legal meaning, and this is now the favored slander of the day, that Israel is an apartheid state. I do recommend you check out NGO Monitor's report showing how it's all just a lie. It's all just a lie. That's the short version. Okay. As we wind down towards the end, Scott talks about how to evaluate ideologies critically. So as a rule, as has become clear over the last few minutes, I hope, dangerous ideologies depart radically from the golden rule and the motto. That's when they become dangerous, when they are selectively applied, when double standards are applied, et cetera, et cetera. How do Marxism, communism, which is really the ultimate source of decolonial theory and critical race theory, how do they violate when they're allegedly committed to equality and justice? These are the calling cries of Marxism and communism. Well, in practice and history, obviously there was much violence associated with establishing various communist regimes, whether it's Stalin or Mao or Pol Pot, all of whom killed millions of people. In the academy, it's due to the fact that the dominant majority, as we mentioned, the hegemony. It's not the presence of these theories on campus that's the problem. It's their hegemony. It's that they dominate to the point where they silence and push out alternative perspectives. The famous left-wing thinker Herbert Marcuse has an essay called Repressive Tolerance, where he justifies repressing dissent in the name of greater tolerance. Right? You suppress dissent in support of a greater truth, which is really sort of crazy if you think about it, right? With this ideology in mind, anyone who disagrees from the reigning ideology isn't merely a dissenter, but they're actually a threat to the virtues of the reigning ideology. The reigning ideology says it's a theory of justice, it's a theory of equality. Virtue lies with us, so anyone who disagrees is clearly harmful and anti-virtue, and therefore they need to be silenced, not merely disagreed with, but silenced. And that straight line, we could talk more about this some other day, straight line from that to today's campus cancel culture. That's exactly what's dominating so many campuses today. We cannot hear alternative points of view because they're harmful. We need to prevent harm and therefore silence and exclude people. My novel Nevergreen is a satire on today's campus cancel culture. But it's all connected, right? This is all sort of one phenomenon here. Today's campuses, you must know, are overwhelmingly liberal Democrat. Like, you constantly see surveys of the number of professors registered as Democrats at a university versus the number registered as Republicans or who identify as conservatives. And the best numbers you get are something like 90% Democrats or 95% Democrats. And sometimes you see 100% Democrats. So this left-wing movement, again, it has just about completed its hegemony. It's really taken over. And it becomes an idolatry when it becomes a dominant ideology. It's no longer a theory that's out there that we can evaluate, that we can critique, that we can compare to the evidence, etc. It becomes a religion and everybody must bow down to it. And that is the problem. That's when these theories go wrong. And that happens when we stop enforcing the golden rule and the motto. We'll skip through the details. We've already covered at least many of the ideas here. Judaism and Zionism drive these folks absolutely crazy. We can skip that. That takes us into part 5, where Scott is really focusing more on positive things by, again, showing in slow motion how good theories can become bad over time. Examining Northwestern again. Remember, the book focused on Northwestern, but is also about the phenomenon in general. As we get to the end, he comes back to Northwestern one more time and shows how Northwestern has not properly put up, or argues anyway, that Northwestern has not properly put up the defense of the golden rule and motto that is clearly merited. And as a result of this failure to defend the rule and motto, that's what allows these theories to take over and become hegemonous, take over and utterly control and dominate. So this is the source of the problem, and therefore it's got to be the solution, or at least part of the solution, in addition to awareness of epistemic anti-Semitism, as I mentioned earlier. Of course, the difficulty is who should be enforcing these academic and intellectual norms. And the deep problem is it really should be the faculty. But in practice, the faculty have become the core of the problem. We've got entire departments devoted to anti-Zionism. Again, remember the statements from May 2021. So the faculty are not pulling their weight. They are the source of the problem. The students, of course, they're not the ones with the right power. They're not the ones who are able to do this. And indeed, the students are the ones who are really on the front lines, being targeted in so many ways by the anti-Zionists, anti-Semites, etc. We can discuss a number. We started day number 1 talking about incidents on campus. We could go back through a bunch more to see how Jewish students and Zionist students are just blatantly targeted on campuses all over the place. Now, though, we looked at it at the beginning, that was the motivation for studying this. But now that we've gone through all of this and we understand the power of these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and the ideology, as we go back through the incidents again, I think you can feel them in a new way. You can feel the brunt. You can feel the theories being put into practice by targeting the Jews on campus. Indeed, most anti-Israel activity on campus today doesn't even target Israel. They know they can't do anything to Israel. What's a student government resolution going to do to Israel, which is a powerful army and a powerful economy, et cetera, et cetera? What they do instead is they target the local Jews. They're Jewish students, sometimes Jewish faculty, Jewish administrators, sometimes as well, but primarily Jewish students. So by reviewing some of these incidents again, and they are legion, there's no limit to them, we can see these theories being put into practice and targeting the Jews. I don't mean to be dramatic. Some people don't like Holocaust comparisons, but Hitler's Nazi Germany began with ideology. It began by taking over the universities. It began with propaganda that turns the Jews into enemies And then the next step is violence, Kristallnacht and the beginning of the Holocaust, et cetera, et cetera. There's a clear path how ideas get turned into practice. And the scary thing to me as I look at campuses today, we're several steps along that path now. And there's even been small outbreaks of violence too. Doesn't mean we're going to go that route, but it's not impossible that we could. And that's why this issue is such a burning issue. And that's why I'm so grateful that Scott has written this book and made this so clear. So to return to the golden rule, to reinforce the rule and the motto, how do we do that? There's some bumps and obstacles along the way. No antidote to corruption like the truth. So here's Scott again being a little optimistic, but this is, I think, also useful, practical suggestions for the return to the basics, the return to the golden rule. He takes us through a number of proposals, ensure that research studies are well-founded empirically all along the knowledge chain. You start to get these problems, as we framed it, when you violate the motto and the rule. But one way that happens is when you get into the world of theory, you no longer have to anchor what you're saying in the facts. That's what can allow a Judith Butler to say Hamas and Hezbollah, part of the progressive left, when they like to murder people from the progressive left. She's so caught up in her theory and so divorced, so not anchored in the facts that there's no restrictions, no constraints on what you can say. So to counter that, make sure research studies are well-founded empirically. Mandate courses on the ethics of scholarship in all fields for at least upper class and graduate students in all fields, maybe even for professors, because there have been some issues in corruption and academic fraud as well in general over these years. So mandate courses on the ethics of scholarship. Donations from foreign countries, we only talked about this a little in passing, but a number in particular of Arab countries, Qatar, for example, has given many millions of dollars to a number of institutions, including Northwestern. And when they give millions of dollars, they create centers for Middle East studies, for example, which then get populated by the anti-Zionists. And you can see pretty clearly this agenda. Donations from foreign countries clearly must be limited and subject to extreme public scrutiny. And lastly, in general, and I would add to this myself, must cultivate proper diversity of thought that adheres to the standards and respects our common humanity. So we have to break hegemonies. Again, Scott is not advocating that we don't study these other theories. It's just that we also have to be able to study theories that disagree with them, theories that criticize them, theories that dissent as well. This might involve mandating free speech training. And again, it sounds funny to mandate free speech training, but it might well be necessary. There's basic principles of free speech, and that's what's being violated. When that's violated, you're violating the motto and the rule. So to reinforce the motto and the rule, we need to support academic free speech, and therefore we need to train people on what's involved with that. So those are some of the positive ideas. I mentioned at the start, I am not an optimistic person. I feel these are dark times, but ours is not, to quote Pirkei Avot once again, ours is not to complete the work. I don't think we're going to solve this problem, not immediately, but neither are we free to desist from it. We have no choice. We must battle this battle. And I'm so grateful to Scott again for writing this book. Hopefully his ideas will get out there. More and more people will begin to see we are badly outnumbered. So the more of us we get, the better the chances we have. I think we are obliged to fight this fight, even if it looks very dark at the moment. I hope you found this material useful. As I said, please reach out to me through my website, andrewpessin.com, to communicate. I'm sorry I had to go through the question period, but at least I was able to get to the end and be able to say thank you. And please do stay in touch. Thanks again to Alums for Campus Fairness as well for sponsoring this series. And I hope you'll be in touch. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you to Scott and for his book and for your book and the work that both of you are doing to cut through the chaos of everything that's happening on campus. And if not, provide the listeners with a positive idea of what's happening, at least providing them with a full perspective of what's happening and why it's happening. And we look forward to working with you in the future. Everyone go to Andrew Pessin's website, www.andrewpessin.com, And remember to share the link for Conspiracy U. You can find it on Amazon. You can also find it on Goodreads, and you can find it on the website, which is in the original email. And if you have any friends or family that want the book, encourage them to buy the book as well, because this is very important. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Andrew, for leading this series.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Have a great night. Bye now.